Hello everyone and welcome to a truly incredible game between Vasyl Ivanchuk and Magnus Carlsen from the Julius Baer Generation Cup. It is a very long game, so do not watch it if you don't have the time. It lasts for 120 moves, but it is quite a spectacle. Of course, Magnus is considered to be one of the greatest chess players who ever lived, alongside, let's say, Garry Kasparov and Bobby Fischer. And, well, there are, if you have a top three, those are basically the top three. If you have a top five, then, everyone's listed different, but he's always in there. Whereas Chucky here, he is considered to be a player who can crush any of those players, on a good day. So any game against him is always very interesting. He's a very mysterious person and, well, just incredibly, it's incredibly enjoyable to watch his games. So let's dive straight into it. And when I say the worst moves or the worst game, I mean, if this was analyzed as a classical game, of course, it's a rapid game. So, with not so much time on the clock, you, of course, will miss things. So, take that with a grain of salt, as usual, when I say something. So let's dive straight into it. Vasyl has the white pieces and he opens with d4. Knight to f6 by Magnus. We have c4, pawn to e6, and everyone was very happy when e6 was played, because this is basically this is the same position that was on the board when Magnus resigned from Han. So maybe everyone thought, okay, what is Magnus doing here? But he played e6 and then everyone was happy again. So knight to c3 and bishop to b4. And what more could we hope for than to see a Nimzo-Indian defense between Chucky and Magnus? So e3, going for the normal line. We have c5 by Magnus, and now knight to e2. Bishop d3, always the more popular move, but knight to e2 also very much played. b6, we have pawn to a3, and now Magnus goes back. Bishop to a5. We have pawn to d5, and now we have castles. Rook to b1, now preparing b4 to trap the bishop here, and of course knight to a6, keeping an eye on that b4 square. f3, Magnus preparing to artificially castle with king to f2, and now there is a game where b5 was played, but here we have e captures on d5 by Magnus. Sorry, I meant Vasyl ready to artificially castle with king to f2, and Magnus plays e captures on d5, which is a new move. So already as of move 9, we have a completely new game, which is very exciting, as this is the Nimzo-Indian defense. So c captures on d5 by Vasyl. We have pawn to b5 by Magnus, and now king to f2. The king will be very safe here, and of course you just got the king away from this nasty diagonal, so very good. So rook to b8 by Magnus, again preparing that b4 push, and pawn to e4, now preparing e5. So Magnus stops this. We have pawn to d6, and now bishop to e3. We have knight to d7, and now we have knight to g3, opening up the light square bishop. We have c4, and now only now Vasyl strikes with pawn to b4. We have c captures on b3 by Magnus, knight captures on b5, now putting pressure on that a7 pawn, and Magnus plays something very, very mysterious. He plays queen to f6, and he says, all right, you have your a7 pawn, and I'm gonna play something, well, you probably will not guess. So bishop captures on a7, and now he plays knight e to c5, knight a to c5, which is awesome, as he sacrifices the exchange on b8. But Vasyl doesn't want the exchange right away. He first wants to trade queens, and Magnus is very happy with this, as now he doesn't have to sacrifice the exchange. So queen captures on d4, knight captures, and now he plays rook to a8, attacking the bishop here. Bishop captures, we have knight captures on c5, and now knight g to f5. Just putting pressure on that d6 pawn. We have bishop to b6, and now, as the king might be very vulnerable here on f2, king to g3. We have bishop captures on f5, knight captures, and only now rook f to d8, defending the d6 pawn. Bishop to c4, preparing to bring the other rook into the game, and now, only now, rook captures on a3, as also the b3 pawn was under attack. So rook h to d1, and now pawn to g6, chasing away the knight. So knight e7 check, king g7, and knight to c6. And here comes the first brilliancy of the game from Vasyl. Magnus has to play rook d to a8 here, but it seems like such a weird thing to do, so Magnus plays rook to c8. It makes sense, the knight is here, the bishop is here, but this allows Vasyl to just play bishop captures on b3, and it shouldn't be possible, as the Magnus is defending the b3 square twice, but it is possible. If rook captures on b3, then rook captures, knight captures, Vasyl just plays rook to b1, and he will win back his piece. He will keep the extra pawn and retain a better position. And of course, if you play knight captures on b3, just rook d3, and again, you are in big trouble. So after bishop captures on b3, Magnus was very unhappy, but okay, the game has to continue. He plays bishop to d8, which is very sad. He just lost the past b pawn. So bishop to d8, and now bishop back to c2. We have bishop to f6, and now rook to d2. Rook c to a8 now. The rook finally goes to the square where it should have gone all along, and now rook to e2, preparing at some point to bust open the position. Rook to c3, putting pressure on the bishop, and just bishop back to d1. We have pawn to h5 by Magnus, and just king to f2. The king will be very safe there. So knight to d3 with check, king to f1, and now pawn to h4. We have rook to c2 now. Rook to c2, offering a trade of rooks. Rook captures on c2, bishop captures on c2, and now knight back to e5, offering a trade of knights, but just bishop back to d1. Of course, Vasyl would be very happy if Magnus captured on c6, then he just gets a nice passed c6 pawn. So rook a2, now saying, okay, now your king cannot leave this square, but just bishop to e2. We have knight to d7 now. And pawn to g3, challenging this structure, but Magnus just plays knight to c5, and after rook to c1, he plays knight to b3, attacks the rook here, rook to d1, and now pawn to h3, and now it could be very dangerous. Now the h2 pawn is weak, so king to f2, we have bishop to b2, and this bishop to b2 maneuver is spectacular. Magnus's plan is the one from the thumbnail. He wants to play bishop to b2 to a3 to c5 to g1, and then pick up the h2 pawn. Seems like a lot of moves, but if he can do it, then he can do it. So bishop to b2, and now Vasyl can just wait and see what happens. He has to create a counterplay. So f4, e5 is coming. Bishop to a3, we have king to e1, and now bishop to c5. You would have to move the king out of check either way. So here we have pawn to e5, and now bishop to g1, going after the h2 pawn, and just e captures on d6. And now Chucky already has d7 and d8 planned, so how can Magnus stop this? The best way to stop it is bishop captures on h2. But Magnus did not go for that. He went for knight to c5 first. I can even show bishop captures on h2, and if d7, there's bishop captures on g3 with check. And now after king f1, there's even knight to d2 with check, and now after king to g1, there's knight e4. And you cannot bring a queen into the game. It will be very, very hard to play this with white. Objectively, it's a draw, but just for fun, I will show you what happens if queen is brought into the game. Then comes rook captures on e2, and after a move, let's say queen, you have to play something, but there isn't a good move you can play. Whatever you play, you're just gonna get checkmated here. There's the pawn is coming, and that's it. For example, you play something weird, you put the queen, let's say, on d7. It's just a matter of bishop to h2 check, and now after the king moves wherever, knight to g3 will be checkmate. So you have to be very, very precise to actually draw this. But okay, after he captures on d6, Magnus went for knight c5. He says no reason to even allow d7. And now we have rook to c1, putting pressure on that knight, again, with the idea of maybe capturing, pushing d7. But now Magnus finds bishop captures on h2. Very, very strong move. We have rook captures on c5, grabbing the knight, and now bishop captures on g3 check. We have king to d1, and now pawn to h2. Now Magnus's pawn is much, much closer to the queening square. So bishop to f3 must be played, otherwise you're getting checkmated. And now rook to f2, again precisely played by Magnus. Rook to c2 now, offering a trade of rooks, and here Magnus plays rook to f1 with check. Interestingly, if you play rook captures on f3, then it seems like you are getting a pawn here, but rook captures on h2 was the idea. And if bishop captures on h2, there's king e2 now, attacking the rook, not allowing the rook any squares along the third rank. And if bishop captures on f4, now not picking up the rook, but playing d7, And then after rook to e3 check, king f2, bishop g5 guarding the queening square, you actually promote. And after bishop captures, now you will pick up the rook and you get this position where Magnus would be up a pawn in a very, very unpleasant position. You know, playing, pushing those pass pawns. And okay, this is also a pass pawn, but the black king is very close to it. So I don't know, maybe with perfect play you can draw this, but it's very hard to say. So after rook c2, we have rook to f1 check by Magnus, not going for this idea, king to e2, and now again you can repeat rook f2 check and go for what I've mentioned, but he didn't see it the first time, so he just goes rook captures on f3. Now, of course, if the rook is captured, you bring a queen into the game, well, what else are you going to do? Well, there is a move, rook to c1. You just don't allow the queen to come into the game. Of course, that was not played in the game. In the game, king captures on f3 was played. He allows Magnus the queen. h1 queen with check, king captures on g3, and now queen captures on d5. And this is the position that, well, it's just unbelievable because, well, the threat is queen to d3 check, and then the rook hangs. Can you do something about this? Not really. Whatever you do, the queen will hunt the white king along the board, and you will pick something up. So here, knight e5, guarding the d3 square, preventing queen to d3 check, and the Magnus actually believes, Vasyl, that this is possible. And Magnus just grabs a pawn, when in fact, queen to b3 check just picks up the rook. So yeah, that was missed. So queen captures on d6. It was incredible time trouble here. So of course, players miss a lot of things. Rook to c6. We have queen to a3 check, knight to f3, and now pawn to f6. So Magnus can still push for more than a draw here, but he has to be very, very precise. Rook to c4. We have king to f7, and now rook to e4. Vasyl will do his best to create some sort of a fortress here. Queen to d3 attacks the rook, rook d4 now, chases away the queen. Queen e3, just rook to d5. We have king to e6, and now rook to b5. We have king to d6, and now rook to a5. We have queen to c3 attacking the rook, but just rook b5. So Vasyl is very happy just shifting the rook back and forth. King to c6, and now rook to b8, hoping to get rook to b8, rook to c8 check to pick up the queen, but of course Magnus will not fall for that. King d5, rook to g8, now going after the pawns, and king to e4, putting pressure on the knight, so you have to go back, rook e8 check, king to f5, and now rook to e2. We have queen to d3 now, again attacking the rook, and rook to e1. We have g5 now, f captures on g5, and here Magnus finds queen to d6 check, king g2, and now f captures on g5. And here we have rook to f1, which is kind of a good idea, but it allows Magnus to push for the win only if he finds the correct idea, but he doesn't. Magnus pushes g4. You have to pin the knight first. Queen d5, let's say, now pins the knight, and you are now threatening g4, and this allows black to actually win this. For example, king g3, queen to d3 now, pinning the knight again, and after king g2, you pin the knight again, and after king g3, you pin the knight again, and after king g2, you push g4. That's the only way to push g4, and now it doesn't matter. You do have some discoveries. You can even deliver a double check, but it doesn't matter. For example, if knight h4 check, you just play king to g5, and the knight is trapped. So knight here obviously doesn't work. And what else is there? If you play knight to g1 check, king g5 again, and after rook f2, you are hoping for some sort of a fortress, but after queen d3 and rook repeating f1, king h4, we have rook f2 repeating, now queen e4 check, king to f1, and now g3, and after rook to b2, now it's only a matter of delivering the proper check and picking up the rook, because the rook can no longer remain here. So let's say queen to f4 check, king g2, you waste the move, king to g4, because the white knight doesn't have any good moves. You can't move it here, you can't move it here, and of course if you move it here, then the rook is no longer guarding the f2 square, so you have to move the rook, and once you move the rook, it's a queen e4 check, king f1, and queen to b1 check, finally picking up the rook. But okay, like I said, if this was a normal game, it was possible, but players are very low on time, so queen d5 or queen to c6, pinning the knight is the way to go. But Magnus played g4, and now Vasyl can get a nice draw here if he plays the correct idea. And the correct ideas are knight to d2 check, knight to d4 check, but definitely not knight to h4 check. With knight to h4, it's still possible to win the game for Magnus, but he has to move the king away from that pawn. He has to play king to e6 or king to e5. However, after king to g5 is played, which also seems like a perfectly, valid idea, Vasyl shows just what kind of a genius he is, and he finds the incredible fortress. Yes, I know what you guys are thinking. No way, there's a fortress here, but Vasyl finds it. So feel free to pause the video here and try to find this incredible fortress idea for Vasyl while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on being a true genius, much like Vasyl Ivanchuk is. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is knight to f5. That is the good stuff. And now Magnus realizes that there is no way of breaking through, but you have to see many moves ahead to realize why this is a fortress. And now Vasyl will demonstrate why. Queen d5 check, king h2. We have queen to d2 check, now comes king g1, and queen to d3. Seems like a perfectly normal position. You are defending g3, you are ready to push g3, but this is what Vasyl found when he played knight to f5, and it is the only move that gets him a draw. Rook to f2. This is the only move that allows you to create a fortress, because if you move the king, let's say you play king g2, then it's just a matter of queen h3 check, king g1 and g3, and it's game over. However, with rook to f2, it is impossible to push g3 for the rest of the game, because if g3 now, just knight captures on g3, and if queen captures, rook g2 attacks the queen. Of course, the queen cannot move, the king is on g5, you have to trade, and it will be a draw by insufficient material. So after rook f2, Magnus realizes that there is no way to win this. However, he can play this for as long as he wants. It's a move 77, so he will of course continue pushing, and he will try every possible resource. Maybe there's a hidden brilliancy, maybe this is not a fortress. After all, it is more than famous that Magnus Carlsen does not believe in fortresses. So he starts king h5. We have rook h2 check, king to g6, and now just rook back to f2, nicely defending the knight, making sure g3 is forever impossible. King g5, king to g2, queen h3 check, just king g1. We have king to f6, even trying to get Vasyl to go for some sort of a crazy check, which he does. He goes knight g3 check, king to e5, but now just rook to g2. And as long as the queen is here, you have nothing to worry about. So queen h6, but now knight goes back. Knight to f1, queen to b6 check, now rook f2. And now, of course, the g3 square is again guarded by the knight. We have queen to b3 trying to do something, but just rook to g2, now attacking the pawn. So king f4, and now rook back to f2 check. We have king to g5, king to g2, and king to h4. So of course now you have to be careful. Queen h3 might be problematic. So king to g1, now queen to b6, pinning the rook, and now of course g3 would be very good, but just king to g2. We have queen to d4, knight to g3, and now queen to d5 with check. King h2, we have queen to d6, pinning the knight, but it's not a problem, just rook g2. I believe Vasyl was enjoying this position very much, as if you find a fortress against Magnus Carlsen, you will sleep very well tonight, sir. So knight to g5, king g5, we have rook to f2, and now we have king back to h4, rook to g2, and queen to c7, keeping the pin, but just rook g1. It's the only move, but it's not a very difficult one to find. So king to g5, rook g2, king to f4, and now rook to f2 with check. King to e3, king to g2, and now queen to b7 with check. King to g1, queen to b1 with check, but just king to g2. Vasyl not about to get tricked. Now we have queen to h7, again going for that queen to h3 check, but just knight to f1 check, king to d3, and now king back to g1, not a worry in the world. So here we have queen to a7, again pinning the rook, king to g2, unpinning, queen to c7, and now knight to g3. So there is no way of breaking through. Queen to b7 check, king to g1, we have king to d4, and now king to h2, king to e3 attacking the rook, but just king to g1 defending, queen to b1 check, king to g2, and now queen to h7. We have king to g1, queen to h3, and now knight back to f1 with check. King e4, even a nice rook e2 check, king f4, rook to f2 check, king to g5, and now just rook back to g2. Queen to a3 now, and of course knight back to g3 with the exact same setup. So queen to c5 check, rook to f2, we have king to h4, and now king to g2, queen to d5 check, king to h2, and now queen to e5, hoping to win the knight, but just rook g2. And after queen to f4, rook to g1, the only move, but Vasyl found it already, so he will probably find it again. But with Chucky, you never know, so Magnus, of course, will try. Queen to f3, and now rook to g2. We have king to g5, king to g1, and here we have queen to e3 check. And he was in this position on move 122 that Vasyl Ivanchuk and Magnus Carlsen agreed to a draw, as there is nothing more to be done here. Or maybe it was even the 50-move rule, who knows, I wasn't keeping count, but either way, Magnus missed some very, very nice ideas there, but once he gave him an opportunity, he found, but it really took a brilliancy to spot that fortress, and he was able to pull it off. So a big congratulations to Vasyl for pulling this off. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. And again, big congratulations to everyone who found rook to f2 here. It's such a brilliancy, and also if you found this idea after king to g5 to just go for the knight to f5 maneuver to even allow the position to reach that, then you have a bright future ahead of you. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Very nicely done. The two of them never fail to entertain. I would like to thank Marcello de Baros, Paul Sretanovic, Ante Butigan iz Dalmacije, Francis Air, and Guia Parala Paz Interior for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check two of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of this wonderful event until it finishes. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.